For 10 long years, my husband William and his family treated me like an unwanted outsider, a middle-class decoration in their estate. They believed they had successfully stripped me of my late father's manufacturing patents, the very patents keeping their empire afloat. They assumed my quiet compliance was weakness. They had no idea that the licensing agreement they exploited contains a devastating 10-year reversion clause. Today is the anniversary, and they are about to walk directly into the trap. To witness how 10 years of silent endurance turns into a multi-million-dollar reckoning, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. What happens when the wife you dismissed as a dependent quietly owns your entire life? The silver grandfather clock in the grand hallway of the Ridley estate did not tick. It let out a low, hollow thrum that felt like a heartbeat inside the stone walls. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and the scent of expensive lavender wax was heavy in the air. I stood at the long, polished mahogany dining table, slowly arranging a set of gold-rimmed porcelain plates. "Marianne, please don't use that green ceramic dish for the olives," my mother-in-law Genevieve said, her voice floating down from the terrace doorway. She was 68, her silver hair styled into an immaculate, rigid bob, her linen trousers perfectly pressed. "It's so rustic, dear. It belongs in a farmhouse kitchen, not on a Ridley table. We are hosting the executive committee of Ridley Enterprises this afternoon, and we must maintain a cohesive aesthetic." "My father made this dish, Genevieve," I said quietly, my finger tracing the smooth, green-glazed clay. "It was his favorite." "I'm sure it was," she murmured, her tone carrying that polite, dismissive ice she had used for a decade to freeze me out of her world. "But your father was an artisan, Marianne. He didn't understand the demands of a high-society dining room. Put it in the pantry, please, and make sure the crystal is polished. The last time there was a water spot on the water goblets." She didn't wait for a reply. She swept out onto the terrace, her silk scarf fluttering in the breeze. I stood in the quiet room, the silver clock thrumming in the background. I didn't get angry. After 10 years of marriage to William Ridley, my emotions had been distilled into a cold, clinical patience. I picked up the green ceramic dish and carried it to the pantry, placing it on the top shelf next to an empty, blue velvet jewel box with a broken brass clasp. The box had once held my father's original industrial design patents, the patents that had revolutionized the manufacturing line of Ridley Enterprises and saved the family firm from bankruptcy 10 years ago. The heavy front doors of the estate opened, and the sharp, clicking heels of my sister-in-law, Caroline, echoed through the marble foyer. She entered the dining room carrying a pair of designer leather heels, dropping them onto the mahogany table right next to my clean porcelain plates. "Marianne, dear, could you take these to the cobbler in the city today?" Caroline asked, not looking at my face as she checked her reflection in the gilded mirror. "The heel has a tiny scuff, and I absolutely must have them for the charity gala tomorrow night. The houseboy is busy setting up the terrace heaters, and I really don't have the time to drive downtown." "I am preparing the lunch for the executive committee, Caroline," I said. "Oh, the caterers are doing most of it, surely," she sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "It'll take you 40 minutes. It's not as if you have a demanding schedule, Marianne. You're here all day anyway." William entered the room then, his charcoal suit pressed, his leather briefcase swinging from his hand. He was 45, the managing director of the family firm, a man who wore his authority like armor. He kissed Caroline's cheek, then looked past me toward the terrace. "William," I said, my voice quiet, "the executive committee is arriving in an hour. Your mother wants me to clear the sideboard." "Then clear it, Marianne," he said, his voice flat, carrying that cold, indifferent distance he had used to replace his affection for me years ago. He didn't look at my face. He was already scrolling through his phone. "And make sure the study is locked. We're reviewing the 10-year patent integration audits today, and we can't have anyone moving the files around." The 10-year audit, I murmured, my hand resting on the silver pocket watch in my apron pocket. Yes, William said, offering Caroline a smug, satisfied smile. The 10-year mark is today. Once the compliance board signs off on the integration files this afternoon, the temporary licensing agreement on your father's patents expires. They permanently merge into the Ridley Enterprises corporate asset pool. It's a formality, but it finally locks the IP under our sole ownership. It's worth $30 million in valuation alone. A formality, I repeated. Exactly, William chuckled, adjusting his gold cufflinks. Your father was a brilliant designer, Marianne, but he didn't understand corporate structures. He signed a standard 10-year integration lease. Today, the lease ends, and the Ridley family takes permanent possession. It's the natural progression of business. I stood beside the mahogany table, watching the two of them discuss the theft of my father's life's work as if they were discussing the weather. For 10 years, they had treated me like a dependent outsider, a middle-class decoration they had generously allowed into their family. They believed my quiet compliance was the silence of a defeated, simple-minded wife who didn't understand the mathematics of their business. They had no idea that the temporary licensing agreement my father had signed 10 years ago had been drafted by my private attorney, Nathaniel West, under my direct, secret instruction. And the 10-year mark was not the date of their permanent integration, it was the date of their execution. Marianne, the red wine glasses are slightly out of alignment on the left side of the table, Caroline said, her voice carrying that tight, supervisory tone she used when she wanted to remind me of my place. She was standing at the double doors of the dining room, her silk dress perfectly draped, her manicured fingers checking her diamond tennis bracelet. And please, ensure the shrimp cocktail is chilled. Victor Bancroft and Alistair Prescott are very particular. They expect the service to be flawless. I have already iced the plates, Caroline, I said quietly, keeping my head bowed as I adjusted the heavy linen napkins. My fingers were cold, but my hand was perfectly steady. Good, she murmured, her eyes scanning the room. William says the audit board is going to review the entire IP portfolio before they sign the restructuring papers. We can't have any domestic distractions. It's critical that everything looks seamless. Caroline, didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked toward the foyer to greet the directors who had just arrived, her heels clicking softly on the marble. They had spent 10 years treating me like an invisible housekeeper in my own home, entirely unaware that the very dining room they were using to finalize their theft had been purchased with my mother's inheritance, or that Victor Bancroft, the senior board member they were so desperate to impress, had once been my father's business partner. By 1 o'clock, the dining room was filled with the warm, golden light of the chandelier and the low, masculine rumble of corporate conversation. William sat at the head of the table, his chest expanded, his face slightly flushed from his first glass of Cabernet. William, gestured with his gold-rimmed wine glass as the board members, Victor Bancroft and Alistair Prescott, watched him. The integration of the Ridley manufacturing patents is the final step of our 5-year growth plan, Victor, William said, his voice carrying that arrogant, performative confidence I had grown to detest. The intellectual property is already fully integrated into our assembly line. Today's audit is simply a formality to lock the patents under our sole corporate umbrella. Victor Bancroft, a silver-haired man with heavy, aristocratic eyelids, took a slow sip of his wine. He looked at William, then his gaze drifted to me as I stood quietly by the sideboard, holding a fresh crystal decanter of water. William, Victor said, his tone quiet. The board is going to require the signed wet ink consolidation certificate to finalize the merger of the IP. Have you secured Marianne's signature on the final release? Oh, the release is a non-issue, Victor, William said, letting out a dry, dismissive laugh as he gestured for me to pour him more water. He didn't look at my face. He merely watched the liquid rise in his glass. Marianne signed the global waiver 10 years ago when we married. Well, she doesn't track the financial side. She has her house projects to keep her busy. We don't need her here for this. Yes, Caroline chimed in, offering Alistair Prescott a conspiratorial smile. Marianne is much happier staying behind the scenes. She keeps the estate running beautifully, and we try to keep her free from all the stressful corporate business. It's much better for her. I stood right beside my husband, the heat of his shoulder radiating through my apron. I could smell his expensive cologne, the red wine on his breath, and the heavy, silver-plated decanter in my hands. Marianne, dear, William muttered, his voice dropping into a sharp, dismissive whisper without his head turning. Go check on the coffee. And please, tell the kitchen to warm the dessert plates. They were slightly cold last time. Of course, William, I said softly. I walked back into the butler's pantry, the heavy oak swinging door closing behind me with a soft, padded sigh that shut out the dining room. I set the silver decanter on the stainless steel counter. My hands were perfectly steady. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my secure phone, my fingers typing quickly as I sent a message to Nathaniel West, my private attorney. 13:14. William Ridley verbally confirmed to board members Victor Bancroft and Alistair Prescott that he intends to bypass the final signature requirement on the patent consolidation, relying on the 10-year-old waiver. Audit is currently active in the study. A second later, the screen lit up with a reply from Nathaniel. The county court has just processed the formal reversion of patent rights filing, Marianne. The temporary licensing agreement has officially expired. Ridley Enterprises no longer has the legal right to manufacture their primary product line. The trap is live. I closed the phone and slid it back into my pocket. They had spent 10 years treating me like a piece of household utility, entirely unaware that when you treat someone like a piece of furniture, you speak in front of them as if they are made of wood. They had discussed their asset shifts, their legal workarounds, and their plans to strip my father's legacy right in front of my face, completely blind to the fact that the woman pouring their water was compiling their bankruptcy files. I picked up the hot coffee service, my face perfectly smooth, my voice carrying the quiet, empty tone of a wife who had finally stepped completely behind the curtain. Coffee is served, gentlemen, I said, pushing the pantry door open with my shoulder. The rain began to tap against the high windows of the kitchen by 3 o'clock, a steady gray drizzle that blotted out the valley below. I stood at the sink, my hands warm in the soapy water, washing the delicate crystal glasses by hand. Caroline walked into the pantry, her heels clicking softly, carrying a heavy cardboard box of files. She set it on the clean counter, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Marianne, William needs these older financial ledgers destroyed, Caroline said, her voice carrying that light dismissive tone she used when she was handing me a chore. Take them to the secure document destruction facility on 8th Street. The staff is busy preparing the terrace for the evening reception, and William doesn't want the noise of the paper shredder running in the house while the directors are in the study. I am hand-washing the crystal, Caroline, I said quietly, not looking up from the sink. Oh, the crystal can wait, dear, she murmured, her hand waving toward the garage keys hanging on the wall. It'll take you an hour. It's a simple drive, and honestly, you have the afternoon free anyway. Just get it done. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel, took the keys, and lifted the heavy box of files. Underneath the dusty tax folders and old ledger books, I saw the labels on the files. Alden Industrial Patents, original drafts. My father's name was Arthur Alden. William had spent the last 10 years trying to erase my father's name from every corporate document, And now he wanted to physically shred the original drafts of the licensing agreements we had signed in 1994. He believed that by destroying these papers, he was erasing the final paper trail of the temporary terms. I drove my modest sedan through the gray rain, the windshield wipers squeaking rhythmically. Instead of going to the document destruction facility, I pulled into the quiet, tree-lined parking lot of a diner on the edge of the city. A dark sedan was already parked in the corner. Nathaniel West, my private attorney, was waiting for me in a corner booth, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He was 50, a sharp, quiet man who had been my father's trusted legal counsel before his death. I sat opposite him and slid the heavy cardboard box across the table. Nathaniel pulled out the blue folder, his eyes scanning the yellowed original documents. A slow, thin smile touched his lips as he read the handwritten annotations my husband had made on the margins 30 years ago. "Thomas has no idea these are still in the house, does he?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low and professional. "No," I said, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. "He told me they were clutter. He wanted me to incinerate them." "If he had read these," Nathaniel said, tapping his finger against the paper, "he would have realized that the aggregate deed was cross-collateralized with his own personal trust shares. By signing the restructuring papers on Friday afternoon, he legally tied his personal real estate portfolio to the old Route 4 aggregate liabilities. He didn't just transfer the land, Adeline. He transferred his entire personal wealth to Callaway Commercial Holdings, which is now completely owned by you." The realization settled in my chest, cold and quiet. He thought he was stripping me of my father's work. "He was," Nathaniel said. "But he didn't read the reversion clause. On Wednesday morning, when the patent license officially terminates, the manufacturing line at Ridley Enterprises will legally freeze. If they want to continue production, they will have to lease the patents from you, under your terms." "Thank you, Nathaniel," I said softly, looking at the rain tapping against the diner window. "Keep the file safe." I returned to the estate at 5:30, the silver grandfather clock in the hallway thrumming its heavy, slow count as I walked in. The house was quiet, the executive committee having retired to their hotels before the evening gala. I prepared a hot tea tray, carrying it down the long hallway toward William's study. As I approached the heavy mahogany doors, I heard the voices of William and Simon Harrington, his personal legal advisor, through the gap in the wood. They believed the house was empty. "The board will sign the final patent integration certificates tomorrow morning, William," Simon was saying, the rustle of heavy bond paper echoing through the door. "Once the merger is filed, the trust is locked. Are you ready to proceed with the divorce filings?" "The papers are already drafted, Simon," William's deep, arrogant voice replied. "I'll have the courier serve her on Wednesday morning at noon. She'll get a small monthly stipend, but the estate and her father's patents remain under my sole control. She doesn't have the financial resources or the mind to challenge us in court." "It's a clean sweep," Simon muttered. "She won't have a leg to stand on." "Exactly," William said, his voice flat, carrying the cold, absolute indifference of a man who had finally decided to discard a piece of unwanted luggage. "She's been a dependent outsider in this family for 10 years. It's time she went back to where she belongs." I stood in the dim hallway, the heavy silver tea tray warm in my hands, my father's pocket watch ticking in my pocket. The betrayal was complete, its cold efficiency staggering. For 10 years, I had accepted their silence, their fake kindness, and the small, daily humiliations of being treated like a servant in my own home. I had done it because I believed in some fragile corner of my heart, that my husband would eventually remember why he had married me. But looking at the dark gap in the study doors, I realized the truth. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a transaction. I smoothed down my apron, pushed the heavy door open, and walked inside. "Your tea is served, gentlemen," I said, my face perfectly smooth, my voice carrying the quiet, empty tone of a wife who had finally closed the books. The evening of the pre-gala cocktail gathering arrived with a sharp, frost-tinged wind that rattled the copper downspouts of the estate. The grand hallway was brightly lit, smelling of expensive white lilies and the chemical heat of the catering sternos. Caroline had hired a high-end catering team, but she cornered me in the butler's pantry just as the first guests were arriving. "Marianne, I need you to manage the hot coffee and tea service on the terrace," she said, her voice dropping into a tight, hushed whisper so the staff wouldn't hear her. Her fingers were busy adjusting her diamond necklace in the pantry mirror. "The caterers are so clumsy with the family silver, and honestly, with William's board members arriving, we want the presentation to be seamless. We don't need any domestic distractions." "I will handle the silver, Caroline," I said quietly, my hand resting on my apron. "Good. And please, wear the plain gray wool shawl. Your black sweater looks so faded under the terrace lights. We have a reputation to maintain tonight." I didn't answer. I lifted the heavy, boiling hot silver samovar, a massive, solid silver urn that had belonged to William's grandmother, and carried it out onto the terrace. The air outside was freezing, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the house. The terrace was filled with the elite of the city's manufacturing circle, their laughter light and performative under the heated glass lamps. William was standing near the stone balustrade, his arm casually slung around the shoulders of Alistair Prescott, his face slightly flushed from the champagne. As I set the heavy, burning hot silver samovar onto the stone table, my fingers slipped against the scorching metal handle. A drop of boiling water splashed onto the back of my hand, leaving a sharp, searing red welt. I flinched, my hand hitting the side of the silver tray with a loud metallic clink that cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. William turned his head at the sound, his brow furrowing in deep executive irritation as he saw me clutching my burned hand against my gray wool shawl. "Marianne, please," William said, his voice dropping into a sharp, dismissive whisper that was entirely audible to everyone standing near the table. He didn't ask if I was burned. He didn't offer a hand. He merely looked at the water spot on the tray with a look of pure aristocratic distaste. "If you can't handle the family silver without making a scene, please go back to the kitchen. We have guests. It's embarrassing." "I'm sorry, William," I said, my voice quiet, carrying no trace of the sharp, throbbing pain in my hand. "Just let the catering staff handle it, dear," Caroline chimed in, offering Alistair Prescott a conspiratorial, pitying smile. "Marianne's coordination hasn't been quite what it used to be lately. We try to keep things very simple for her, but she insists on helping. Marianne, go run some cold water over that." I stood there for 3 long seconds, my hand cradled against my chest, watching the faces of my family and their guests. They looked at me with a mixture of polite discomfort and dry amusement, a look they had practiced for 10 years to freeze me out of their world. In their minds, my pain was a domestic inconvenience, a minor, clumsy distraction that threatened the perfection of their beautiful, debt-funded lifestyle. I turned and walked back into the pantry, the heavy oak door closing with a soft, final thud that shut out the terrace. I stood at the stainless steel sink, running cold water over my burned hand. The skin was red and blistered, but my mind was perfectly cold, filled with a sharp, crystallizing clarity. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my secure phone, and began to type with my uninjured hand. October 13th, 2015. On the terrace of the estate, William Ridley made false statements regarding my physical and mental coordination to board advisor Alistair Prescott in the presence of Caroline Ridley, attempted to establish false narrative of physical and mental incompetence to clear path for legal separation. I closed the phone and slid it back into my pocket. They believed they were writing the final chapter of my life. They had no idea that every public humiliation they inflicted, every cold dismissal they used to erase my presence, was simply another page in the evidence folder I was preparing to hand to the federal regulatory liaison tomorrow morning. I dried my hand on a clean kitchen towel, my father's brass watch ticking in my pocket. Tick, tick, tick. The storm was finally here, and I was the one who had opened the door. The physical boundaries of my life in the estate were shrinking, closing in on me like the walls of a cold stone cellar. On Friday morning, I found Caroline in the library, a large cardboard box at her feet. She was systematically pulling my old leather-bound accounting ledgers, the ones from the early years when we ran the business out of my father's small workshop, off the mahogany shelves. These books contained the original, handwritten records of our first client accounts, our first manufacturing licenses, and our first profits. "Caroline," I said, stepping into the room, my voice quiet but firm. "What are you doing with those?" She didn't look up, her fingers busy wrapping the old leather books in cheap packing paper. "Oh, Marianne, we're redecorating the library. William needs these shelves cleared for his new regional safety trophies and his golf plaques. These old ledgers are just collecting dust. They smell like mold, and honestly, they don't fit the modern executive aesthetic we're going for." "Those are the company's original records," I said, taking a step toward her. "My father and I kept those books." "Well, everything is digitized now, Marianne," she said, her voice dropping into that light, dismissive tone she used to end conversations with me. "No one needs 30-year-old paper. I'm having the houseboy carry them down to the damp storage room in the basement. It's much better out of sight." I stood there, watching her pack my history into a cardboard box. It was a visible, physical exclusion, a quiet erasing of my presence from the very rooms I had helped build. I was being moved to the basement, book by book, memory by memory, until there was nothing left of me on the main floor but my apron and my broom. Before I could answer, William came out of his study, his face tight, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He stopped when he saw me standing near the box, his brow furrowing in deep paternal irritation. "Marianne," he said, his voice flat and warning. "Don't hover. Simon and I have a conference call with the merger legal team in 10 minutes. We have sensitive SEC draft documents laid out across the desks in the study." I don't want you going near the study today, Marianne," William cut me off, his hand reaching out to pull the double doors of the library closed, physically shutting me out of his sight. "With your disorientation lately, we can't risk you misplacing any of the legal folders. Simon lost a shipping manifest yesterday, and we suspect you might have put it in the recycling. Just stay in the kitchen and focus on the dinner prep. It's much safer." The double doors clicked shut. I stood in the dim hallway, the heavy brass keys at my waist resting cold against my thigh. The emotional distance was absolute now. They had locked the study door, not because they were worried I would misplace their files, but because they couldn't bear to look at the woman they were preparing to destroy. At midnight, the house was dark, the only light the pale blue glow of the security system keypad in the foyer. I stood outside the study door, my feet bare on the cold Persian rug, my ear pressed against the heavy oak wood. I could hear the low, hushed voices of William and Simon inside. They believed everyone else was asleep. Did Dr. Gregory Sinclair sign the preliminary evaluation form? Simon's voice was hushed, carrying a nervous, predatory excitement. Yes, William's deep baritone replied, accompanied by the rustle of heavy bond paper. Sinclair signed it yesterday morning. He noted that Marianne has been showing progressive cognitive decline, disorientation, and an inability to manage her own daily affairs. He recommends a formal conservatorship under my sole direction. And the board? Simon asked. Will they accept it without a second opinion? They have to, William muttered, the sound of ice clinking in his glass echoing through the door. Gregory Sinclair is a respected member of the country club and a personal friend of Victor Bancroft. Once the board sees Sinclair's medical signature, they won't dare question my legal right to sign the trust proxy on her behalf. We'll pass the restructuring resolution on Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the offshore transfer will be complete. And the divorce papers? They'll be served on Wednesday at noon, William said, his voice cold, flat, and entirely devoid of human warmth. She'll be out of the house by nightfall. The condominium on Elm Street is already leased. Her personal effects are already being packed. I stood in the freezing dark of the hallway, my hand gripping my apron pocket. The betrayal was complete, its cold efficiency staggering. For 10 years I had accepted their silence, their fake kindness, and the small, daily humiliations of being treated like a servant in my own home. I had done it because I believed, in some fragile, maternal corner of my heart, that my husband would eventually remember who I was. But looking at the legal document in my hand, I realized the truth. They didn't see a wife, they didn't see a mother, they saw an obstacle, a piece of outdated machinery they needed to decommission and discard. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket, the microphone pressed close to the gap beneath the study door, the digital recording light glowing a soft, steady red in the dark. Dr. Gregory Sinclair, October 13th. Unauthorized medical evaluation signature without physical consultation. Collusion with William Ridley to commit corporate proxy fraud and illegal conservatorship filing. I turned off the recorder and slipped the phone back into my pocket. They believed they had built a perfect trap. They believed they had covered every legal angle, bought every necessary vote, and secured every signature to erase me from the company and the family. They didn't know that on Wednesday morning, when William stood before the board of directors to present his incompetent wife's proxy, the board would not be looking at a medical evaluation. They would be looking at a federal compliance folder containing the digital recordings of their late-night conspiracies, the financial logs of their offshore tax evasion, and the signed affidavit of a very healthy, very wealthy chairperson. The physical boundaries of my life in the estate were shrinking, closing in on me like the walls of a cold, stone cellar. On Tuesday morning, the kitchen was completely overrun. Caroline had hired a team of florists and high-end caterers to prepare for the post-merger victory dinner on Wednesday, and the air was thick with the scent of crushed herbs and expensive lilies. "Marianne, what are you doing in here?" Caroline hissed, cornering me near the refrigerators. She was wearing a silk blouse, her clipboard clutched to her chest as she directed the staff. "The catering supervisor said you were hovering. We don't need you in the kitchen today. Go down to the basement laundry room and stay there. I've told the staff you're not to be disturbed, and more importantly, they don't need you getting in the way of the prep. We have a highly specific aesthetic to maintain today." "I was just preparing some tea, Caroline," I said quietly, holding my small ceramic mug. "We have a professional espresso station set up in the sunroom, Marianne," she sighed, waving her hand toward the basement door. "Please, just go. We don't need any domestic confusion." I turned and walked down the steep wooden stairs into the basement. The air down here was cold, carrying the damp limestone scent of the estate's original foundations and the chemically sweet smell of laundry detergent. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the low ceiling, casting long, skeletal shadows across the concrete floor. Before I could even sit on my wooden stool, the basement door at the top of the stairs banged open. William descended the steps, his leather shoes clattering loudly on the wood. He carried 3 heavy cardboard boxes, his face flushed and sweating from the effort. "Marianne," he said, panting as he dropped the boxes onto my clean folding table, sending a cloud of lint and dry paper dust into the air. "The high-capacity office printer in the study is jammed, and the technician can't get here until Wednesday afternoon. I had to route the final board packets to the industrial laser down here." I looked at the boxes. They were filled with thousands of unbound, double-sided corporate sheets. "I need you to manually collate and bind these 50 folders," William said, not looking at my face as he wiped his damp forehead with his sleeve. He didn't even glance at the red, blistered burn on my hand from the silver samovar yesterday. "They have to be in the exact order of the agenda. The board members need them in their hands at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Don't mess up the page numbers like you did with the tax files last month." "My hand is quite blistered today, William," I said softly, holding up my fingers, "and the basement is cold." "Just put on a sweater, Marianne," he muttered, already turning back toward the stairs. He didn't offer to bring down a space heater. He didn't check to see if I had water or if I had eaten lunch. He treated me with the same cold, functional indifference he would show to a broken piece of office machinery. "We don't have time for delays. This merger is worth $40 million. Just get it done." He disappeared up the stairs, the heavy door slamming closed with a sharp, echoing bang that rattled the light bulb above my head. I stood in the cold, damp basement, the silence settling over me like a heavy blanket. I pulled my gray wool shawl tighter around my shoulders. I sat at the wooden folding table and pulled the first stack of papers toward me. My fingers were stiff, the burn on my hand throbbing with a dry, sharp pain. But as I began to slide the sheets into order, my eyes focused on the numbers. Ridley Enterprises, Inc. Audited Financial Statement, Q3. As the original accountant who had built the company's first ledger, I read the balance sheet with a clinical, instinctive clarity. It took me less than 3 pages to find the fraud. William and Caroline had listed our primary assembly line machinery on Route 4 twice. Once under the legitimate operational assets of Ridley Enterprises, and a second time under the asset list of the offshore shell company Ridley Global, Ltd., in the Cayman Islands. It was a massive, illegal double counting of assets, designed to artificially inflate the company's valuation by $12 million to trick the merger partners into a higher buyout rate. It was bold, arrogant, and entirely criminal. I sat in the dim light of the single bulb, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through my shoes, and let out a soft, dry laugh. They had locked me in the basement to keep me out of sight, entirely unaware that they had handed me the very smoking gun I needed to dismantle their lives. They believed I was too simple-minded, too disoriented to understand what I was looking at. I carefully collated the pages. I aligned the margins, pressed the heavy plastic bindings into place, and sealed 50 copies of their own indictment with my own hands. Every folder I completed was another brick in the wall that was about to close around them. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket and snapped crisp, high-resolution photographs of the double-entry pages, ensuring the audited serial numbers of the machinery were perfectly visible. I sent the files directly to Nathaniel West. "We have the double entry, Nathaniel," I whispered into the receiver, the hum of the washing machine hiding my voice. "My God, Marianne," he gasped on the other end. "That's securities fraud. If the SEC sees this, William and his advisors are facing federal prison." "I know," I said, looking up at the wooden ceiling, where I could hear the faint, muffled footsteps of the caterers preparing the victory dinner. "Let the board meeting proceed. I'll deliver the packets myself." The weight of the 3 cardboard boxes was substantial, the heavy paper corners digging into my bruised forearms as I carried the completed board folders up the steep basement stairs. My knees burned, a sharp, white-hot heat flaring with every step, but I kept my grip tight. When I reached the kitchen, the warmth of the room and the rich, expensive scent of roasted beef tenderloin and red wine hit my face like a physical blow. Caroline was standing near the double ovens, reviewing the plating with the catering manager. She turned when she heard the heavy door click, her eyes immediately scanning my disheveled hair, my gray wool shawl, and the dirty cardboard boxes in my arms.
"Oh, just set those in the foyer, Marianne," Caroline said, her voice dropping into a tight, hushed whisper so the catering staff wouldn't hear her. "William will check them later. And then, please, go straight back down to your room. William and William and Mother are in the dining room having a private family toast to celebrate the merger, and it's best if we don't have to explain your state to the staff." "I have not eaten dinner, Caroline," I said softly, setting the boxes on the floor. "Well, don't pick at the catering," she hissed, her eyes wide with a frantic, superficial panic. "Everything is counted per head. There is some leftover cold chicken salad in the plastic container from Saturday in the refrigerator. You can eat that in the laundry room. We really don't need you hovering in the kitchen while the plates are going out." I looked past her into the dining room. Through the leaded glass doors, I could see William, Caroline, and Genevieve sitting at the mahogany table, their crystal champagne flutes clinking under the warm glow of the chandelier. They were laughing, their faces flushed with the absolute confidence of men and women who believed they had successfully conquered their world. They were celebrating their victory with the very folders I had just carried up from the cold basement. I walked over to the commercial refrigerator, my movements slow and deliberate. I pulled out the small, clear plastic container of Saturday's chicken salad. The mayonnaise had separated, leaving a thin, yellowed oil at the bottom of the plastic. A young catering girl, no older than 20, was standing nearby, holding a warm, gold-rimmed plate of beef tenderloin garnished with rosemary. She looked at the separated chicken salad in my hand, then at my worn apron and my blistered knuckles, and her face softened into a look of pure, agonizing pity. "Ma'am," the girl whispered, stepping closer to me, her voice trembling slightly. I can slip you a plate of the tenderloin. We have a few extra portions in the warming oven. You shouldn't have to eat that." "We have a schedule to maintain, please," Caroline sharply corrected the girl from the island, her voice freezing. "The appetizers need to go out immediately. Marianne has her own dietary routine. Please focus on the dining room." The young girl's face went red with embarrassment, and she quickly looked down, carrying the warm plate toward the dining room doors. She had no idea that the housekeeper she was pitying owned the very company that had hired her catering firm. "It's all right," I said softly to the girls retreating back. "I prefer the quiet." I carried my plastic container down to the laundry room, closing the door behind me. I sat on my wooden stool under the single hanging light bulb, eating the cold, dry leftovers with a plastic fork. The steady, mechanical hum of the washing machine was the only sound. The raw, visible neglect was complete. They had stripped me of my home, my family, and my seat at the table. They had reduced me to a shadow that ate their scraps in the basement while they toasted their success on the main floor. But as I sat in the cold, I felt no pain, no resentment, only a profound, clinical detachment. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a single silent notification from Nathaniel West. Compliance directive secured. The Securities and Exchange Commission has formally accepted the operational audit. The Board of Directors has been secretly notified of an emergency
Chairperson's executive session at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, prior to William's merger vote. William and Caroline believed that tomorrow morning was their coronation. They believed they would stand before the board, present my cognitive evaluation, signed by Dr. Sinclair, sign the proxy on my behalf, and finalize the merger. They had no idea that the board would not be voting on a merger. They would be voting on an emergency resolution to strip William and his executive allies of their corporate power, liquidate their shares to cover the fraud penalties, and refer their files directly to the federal prosecutors. I closed the plastic container and set it in the trash bin. I took my father's empty blue velvet jewel box with the broken brass clasp and laid it on the folding table, next to my father's green ceramic olive dish. I polished the silver grandfather clock keys on the red ribbon one last time with my apron, tracing the deep, stamped letters of my father's original name, Mary Ann Ridley. Tomorrow was Tuesday, and the quiet maid of the house was finally going to call the meeting to order. Wednesday morning arrived with a sharp, frost-tinged wind that rattled the copper downspouts of the estate. By 7:30, the quiet sanctuary of my basement laundry room was shattered by the frantic, heavy running of feet on the hardwood floors upstairs. A door slammed. Then, William's voice rose in a high, uncharacteristic pitch of pure executive panic. "Caroline, where is the signed resolution draft? The one from the bank courier. It's not in my leather portfolio." "I don't know, William," Caroline screamed back from the hallway. "I thought you had it. Genevieve, did you move the blue folder off the library table?" "I didn't touch your folders, Caroline," Genevieve shrieked, her heels clicking frantically as she ran between the rooms. "We have 40 minutes before the town car arrives. The board members are already checking into the downtown high-rise." I sat on my wooden stool, quietly sipping my tea from a plain white ceramic mug. The kitchen upstairs was in a state of absolute chaotic tailspin. For 10 years, they had treated my organizational skills as mindless house cleaning, a menial chore they could dismiss. Now, on the most important morning of their corporate lives, they were realizing that they didn't even know where their own documents were, because they had never taken the time to look. The basement door burst open. Caroline stood at the top of the stairs, her silk blouse crooked, her face flushed and slick with sweat. "Mary Ann," she panted, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading tone as she ran down the steps. "The Appendix C folders, the ones you bound last night. I only count 49 in the foyer. Where is the 50th copy? The one for Victor Bancroft. We can't have a board member sitting without a packet." "It is on the third shelf of the pantry, Caroline," I said, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of their frantic energy. "In the black leather case. I put it there so the caterers wouldn't get grease on the cover." "The pantry, right. Thank God," she gasped, already turning to scramble back up the stairs. Before she could reach the door, William appeared at the threshold, his charcoal suit jacket on, but his forehead was wet, his hands shaking as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and absolute, terrifying dependency. "Mary Ann," William said, his voice carrying a sharp, defensive edge. "We need you to come with us in the town car. Now, get your gray wool coat." "The board meeting is a private corporate matter, William," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. "You told me yesterday I didn't have the cognitive focus for it." "It's just a formality, Mary Ann," William hissed, stepping down the stairs, his boots heavy on the wood. He was trying to project his usual authority, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "We need you to physically sign the trust release before the board sits at 9. Dr. Gregory Sinclair will be waiting in the executive anteroom to assist you with the signature. It's just a standard operational procedure. We'll be in and out in 10 minutes. He was lying, and we both knew it. He needed my physical presence in that room to execute the fraudulent proxy. Under Dr. Sinclair's signed evaluation of my cognitive decline, William was going to present me to the board, claim I was incapable of signing myself, and use his sole trusteeship to sign my shares over to his offshore shell company. "I see," I said softly. I set my ceramic mug on the folding table. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, and put on my simple gray wool coat. I reached onto the table and took the heavy brass keys on the red ribbon, sliding them into my pocket alongside my secure phone. "Let's go, William," I said. The drive downtown was silent, a suffocating, heavy tension filling the leather-scented cabin of the town car. William sat on my right, his fingers flying across his phone, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow hitches. Caroline sat on my left, staring out the window, her knee bouncing rhythmically in a frantic, nervous tick. They didn't speak to me. They didn't look at me. In their minds, I was already gone, a piece of obsolete machinery they were towing to the salvage yard. They were completely, utterly dependent on my physical body to complete their $40 million theft, entirely unaware that the woman sitting silently between them was the architect of their imminent arrest. We arrived at the Ridley Enterprises high-rise at 8:45. The glass and steel tower rose 30 stories into the gray, misty sky, its polished facade reflecting the cold morning light. As we stepped into the lobby, the security guards stood at attention, nodding respectfully to William. "Mr. Ridley, morning, sir." "Morning, Carl," William muttered, his head held high, his chest expanded as he walked toward the private executive elevator. He felt like a king. He believed that within an hour he would own the company, the family trust, and the estate, free of the old woman who had built them. The elevator doors closed with a soft, expensive hiss, and we began our silent, rapid ascent to the 30th floor. I looked at the brass keys in my hand, my fingers tracing the cold, stamped letters of the company's name. The power imbalance had shifted completely, but as the elevator climbed, the tension in my chest settled into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They had spent 10 years trying to make me invisible, and in 5 minutes, they were going to realize that the shadow had finally stepped into the light. The executive anteroom on the 30th floor was a temple of brushed steel and glass, offering a panoramic, misty view of the shipping docks far below on the river. Dr. Gregory Sinclair was waiting for us. He sat in one of the low leather chairs, wearing a tailored navy suit and a gold Rolex that caught the harsh fluorescent light. He was our family physician, a man who had spent 30 years attending our country club dinners and accepting William's help with his medical board nominations. "Marianne, my dear," Dr. Sinclair said, rising quickly with a warm, oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped toward me, his hands extended in a gesture of paternal concern. "How are we feeling today? A bit tired? A bit disoriented from the drive?" "I am perfectly well, Gregory," I said, my voice quiet, hands resting in the pockets of my gray wool coat. Of course," he murmured, his tone dropping into that soft, patronizing register he used with children and the elderly. He opened a leather folder on the glass table, revealing 3 copies of the trust release form. "We just have a few simple documents to sign today, Marianne, just to make things easier for you. William and Caroline are going to handle the stressful business decisions from now on, so you can focus on your recovery." William stepped forward, pulling his heavy gold pen from his pocket and sliding it toward my hand. His face was pale, a thin line of sweat glistening near his temple, his eyes drilling into mine with a silent, desperate warning. "Sign here, Marianne," William said, his voice carrying a sharp, hushed authority. "Just the 3 signature lines. The board is already sitting in the next room." I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the signature lines on the paper, where my name had been printed beneath the title, Marianne Ridley, Trustee. "No, Gregory," I said, setting the gold pen down on the glass table. "I am not going to sign this here." William's face went entirely dark. He took a step closer, his body blocking Dr. Sinclair from view as he grabbed my upper arm. His grip was tight, the pressure of his fingers painful through my wool coat. He leaned down, his breath hot against my ear, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "Marianne," William whispered, "you will sign the papers. Now. If you make a scene in front of the board, I will have the security guards escort you to the county medical facility immediately. Dr. Sinclair has already signed the emergency holds. Don't do this. You have nothing." It was the ultimate, raw projection of his cruelty. He believed that his threat of a medical facility would break me, that the fear of being locked away would make me compliant. He still believed he was the master of the house, entirely unaware that the trap had already been sprung. I pulled my arm back, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at my husband, tracing the sharp, selfish lines of his face, seeing the man who had spent 10 years trying to erase my existence. "The board of directors is waiting, William," I said, my voice steady, carrying no trace of fear. "Let's not keep them." I didn't wait for his permission. I turned, pushed the heavy glass door of the boardroom open, and walked inside. The main boardroom was a vast, walnut-paneled room dominated by a massive oval table. 12 board members sat in the high-backed leather chairs, their faces serious, their laptops open. Victor Bancroft sat at the center of the table, his silver hair catching the light. Alistair Prescott sat on his left, a stack of the bound financial folders I had assembled in the basement resting in front of him. As I entered, the board members rose quickly, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and profound confusion. They had been told by William that I was bedridden, suffering from advanced cognitive decline. "Marianne?" Victor Bancroft said, stepping forward, his brow furrowing as he looked at my gray coat, my calm face, and the empty blue velvet jewel box with the broken brass clasp in my hand. We were told you weren't well enough to attend the session." William and Caroline rushed into the room behind me, their faces pale, their breathing shallow and panicked. They tried to position themselves on either side of me, their movements frantic, desperate to maintain the illusion of their protective custody. "Victor, please," William said, his voice rising in a pitch of forced, hysterical concern as he reached for my arm. "Marianne she's had a very difficult morning. She insisted on coming, but she's highly disoriented. We just need to execute the trust proxy quietly in the anteroom." "I am not disoriented, William," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that cut through his panic like a knife. I walked to the head of the table, pulling my father's heavy brass keys on the red ribbon from my pocket and placing them onto the polished wood with a sharp, echoing clack. I opened my secure phone and laid it beside the keys. "Gentlemen," I said, looking around the table at the 12 men who held the stock of the company my father had saved. "This meeting of the Ridley Enterprises Compliance Committee is now in session. I am Marianne Ridley, co-founder and majority shareholder, and we have some corporate fraud to discuss." "Victor, you cannot listen to this!" William's voice rose in a desperate, cracked screech that shattered the pristine, glass-walled silence of the boardroom. He turned to the 12 board members, his face a dark, dangerous purple, his hands clawing at the mahogany table. "Look at her! She's sick! Dr. Sinclair, get in here! Tell them!" Dr. Gregory Sinclair stepped into the boardroom, his tailored suit jacket open, his gold Rolex catching the light. But he didn't look like a confident country club doctor anymore. He was pale, his breathing rapid, his eyes darting to my secure phone with a look of pure, terrified realization. "Yes, Victor," Dr. Sinclair stammered, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the senior board member. "As her personal physician, I must advise, Mrs. Ridley is suffering from advanced cognitive disorientation. Her memory is She is prone to making false, paranoid claims. It is a symptom of her condition. She belongs in a quiet, clinical environment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at Dr. Sinclair. I looked directly at Victor Bancroft. "Victor," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, clinical clarity. "When my father brought you in as a junior partner in 1994, you were a man who prided himself on finding the discrepancies other people missed. Please open your board packet to page 48, the Appendix C folders I manually bound in my basement laundry room last night." Victor Bancroft looked at me, his face pale, his brow furrowing. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened the thick, black-bound folder in front of him. Alistair Prescott and the other 10 board members followed his lead, the quiet, rhythmic rustle of paper filling the room. "The Route 4 assembly line machinery," I said, pointing to the column of figures on my own page. "It is listed on page 48 as an asset of Ridley Enterprises, Inc. It is also listed on page 62 as an asset of Ridley Global Limited in the Cayman Islands. A $12 million double entry designed to artificially inflate the company's valuation for the merger." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Victor Bancroft's fingers stopped on the page. He squinted at the figures, his eyes widening as he looked from page 48 to page 62. "My God," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked up, his gaze locking onto William with a look of pure, freezing anger. "William, this is a double entry of our primary assembly line. This is securities fraud." "No, Victor, it's a clerical error," Caroline shouted, stepping forward, her voice cracking with a frantic, childlike terror. "The auditors, they must have misfiled the registry. My sister, no, Mary Ann, must have swapped the pages in the basement." "And this clerical error," I said, pulling the printed sheets of the draft divorce agreement from my folder and sliding them across the polished walnut table toward Victor, "was to be followed by this document. The dissolution of marriage drafted by William's personal attorney, dated tomorrow, October 15th. Victor Bancroft picked up the document. He read the title. He read the date. He read the clause stripping me of my shares and moving me to a condo on Elm Street under the guise of my cognitive incompetence. He slid the papers to Alistair Prescott, who read them with a look of profound disgust. The 12 board members looked at William. They looked at Caroline. They looked at Dr. Gregory Sinclair, who had already stepped back toward the glass doors of the anteroom, his hand on the handle, desperately searching for an exit. "William," Victor Bancroft said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat register that carried the weight of a corporate death sentence. "You attempted to use this board to execute a fraudulent merger using double-counted assets. And you attempted to use a falsified medical evaluation to strip your co-founder of her legal shares." "Victor, please," William stammered, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his gold pen onto the table. It rolled across the polished mahogany, coming to a stop against my grandfather's heavy brass keys. Mary Ann has been confused. I was trying to protect her. I was trying to protect the company." "You were trying to save your own skin, William," I said softly, closing my secure phone with a quiet, final thud. The absolute crushing silence of the room was complete. William stood at the end of the table, his mouth open, his white shirt soaked with sweat, his entire corporate empire turning to ash before his eyes. He was completely, utterly at my mercy, and he had finally run out of lies to tell. Victor Bancroft closed his folder. He looked around the table at the other 11 board members, receiving 12 slow, grim nods of agreement. "Mary Ann," Victor said, turning his gaze back to me, his tone carrying a deep, respectful deference. "As majority shareholder and chairperson of the Compliance Committee, how do you wish to proceed?" "Victor," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the heavy administrative silence of the boardroom. Ridley Enterprises will not proceed with the merger. The double-counted assets will be corrected on our public ledger immediately, and we will remain a private, family-owned entity. Victor Bancroft nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the manila envelope of the divorce agreement. And the executive leadership, Marianne? I am calling for the immediate, voluntary resignation of William Ridley as Chief Executive Officer and Caroline Ridley as Corporate Secretary, effective at noon today, I said, looking at my husband. Their corporate shares will be absorbed by the family trust, which I will manage as sole trustee. They will have no voting rights, no executive authority, and no access to the corporate accounts. William let out a low, strangled gasp, his face turning a sickly ash gray. He reached out to grab the back of his leather chair to keep his balance. Marianne, please, you're destroying the family. You're destroying everything we built. If they refuse to sign the resignations and the trust transfers by 12 o'clock, I continued, ignoring his pleading entirely as I looked back at Victor, the federal compliance logs and the recorded audio of their securities fraud will be delivered directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission by 2 o'clock this afternoon. I believe the federal prosecutors will find the double entry of our Route 4 machinery very interesting. Victor Bancroft didn't hesitate. He looked around the table at the other 11 board members. All in favor of the chairperson's resolution? 12 hands went up instantly. The speed of corporate abandonment was breathtaking. In the face of federal prison and financial ruin, William's board allies evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving him and Caroline standing alone at the end of the table, like shipwrecked survivors. Resolution passed, Victor said, signing the executive order with a sharp click of his pen. He rose, packing his laptop into his leather case. William, Caroline, I suggest you sign the trust transfers before noon. Marianne, we will wait for your directive regarding the new board appointments. The board members filed out of the room in a quiet, solemn procession, not one of them offering William a hand or a word of farewell. Dr. Gregory Sinclair had already vanished, leaving his gold Rolex and his leather folder behind on the anteroom table. The heavy glass doors closed, leaving only the three of us in the vast, walnut-paneled room. William sank heavily into his executive chair, his head bowing until his forehead touched the polished mahogany table. He was trembling, his hands clenching into fists against his knees. Beside him, Caroline stood frozen, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at the empty chairs of the men who had just stripped her of her title. Marianne, William whispered, his voice cracking, completely hollowed out of his usual executive authority. How are we supposed to live? The country club, the cars, the house. You will live in the estate, William, I said, picking up my father's heavy brass keys on the red ribbon from the table and sliding them back into my apron pocket. But the country club membership is canceled. The Mercedes and the Porsche will be liquidated tomorrow morning to pay for the audit fees. Caroline's dry cleaners and boutique leases will have to find another project. But the housekeeping, Caroline stammered, looking at my gray wool coat. Who is going to run the estate? You and William will, I said softly, my voice carrying a cold, absolute finality that made her flinch. You will perform the actual manual labor to keep the house running. You will sweep the terrace, you will clean the gutters, and you will wash the delicate French Chantilly lace by hand. You will learn the value of the labor you treated as a symptom of my cognitive decline. They didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. The psychological collapse was complete. They had spent 10 years treating me like a servant, and now they were going to spend the rest of their lives earning their keep in my house. The drive back to the estate in the town car was silent. William and Caroline sat huddled together in the back seat, their heads bowed, looking like two defeated prisoners being transported to a cell. I sat in the front seat next to the driver, my eyes fixed on the misty gray highway ahead. When we arrived at the house at 1 o'clock, Genevieve was waiting for us in the sunroom. The silver champagne bucket was already set up on the wicker table, the gold foil of the champagne bottle glinting in the pale afternoon light. She had changed into a stunning silk dress, her face bright with a manic, superficial excitement. "William! Caroline!" Genevieve cried, running into the marble foyer as the front doors opened. "How did it go? Is the merger finalized? Did the board sign off on the transition?" She stopped when she saw their faces. William didn't look at her. He walked past her without a word, his boots dragging heavily on the marble floor as he headed toward his study to begin packing his personal papers. Caroline followed him, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped in a posture of complete, devastating defeat. Genevieve turned to me, her hand pressing against her silk collar, her face going entirely white. "Marianne? What's happening? Why are they looking like that?" I walked past her, my movements slow and deliberate. I took my father's empty blue velvet jewel box with the broken brass clasp from my pocket and laid it on the marble island, next to the silver champagne bucket. "The merger is dead, Genevieve," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, flat tone of a woman who had finally reclaimed her world. "And William is no longer the managing director. Please take the champagne back to the kitchen. It's a very busy afternoon, and we have some laundry to do." On Thursday morning, the sun broke through the gray valley mist, bathing the brick terrace of the estate in a cold, clear light. William, Caroline, and Genevieve stood in the marble foyer, surrounded by cardboard boxes. But the moving trucks parked in the driveway weren't there to carry my things to a suburban condo. They were unloading simple, sturdy wooden furniture, boxes of old books, and medical therapy equipment. Genevieve stared out the double-glass doors, her hands trembling as she clutched her silk robe. "Marianne, what is this? Why are they bringing those hospital beds into the sunroom? Who is moving in here?" I stood at the bottom of the spiral staircase, wearing my plain gray dress and my white apron. I held my secure phone in one hand and my father's heavy brass keys on the red ribbon in the other. "The Ridley Family Trust has formally leased this estate to the Alden Foundation, Genevieve," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the smooth, absolute authority of a woman who had finally rewritten her family's future. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, this estate is no longer a private residence. It is the Arthur Alden Retirement and Wellness Center for retired assembly line workers." William stepped out of his study, his face bloodless, his hair uncombed. He looked at the moving men carrying a heavy oak bookcase past his leather armchairs. A retirement home? For the factory workers? Marianne, you can't be serious. This is our home. You're letting those warehouse workers live here?" "They built this company, William," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "They spent 30 years working the heavy machinery in the freezing winter while you sat in your heated office. It is only fitting that they spend their retirement years in the estate their labor paid for." Before William could answer, a sleek sedan pulled into the driveway. Victor Bancroft, our old friend and senior board advisor, stepped out of the car. He wasn't wearing his executive suit today. He wore a comfortable wool cardigan. Behind him, 3 retired long-haul drivers, men who had driven our first Route 4 routes in 1994, climbed out of the car, laughing and carrying their suitcases. William and Caroline shrank back into the shadows of the foyer, their faces burning with a deep, devastating humiliation. Victor Bancroft walked into the marble foyer, his eyes taking in the hospital beds, the moving men, and finally settling on me. He smiled, a genuine, warm look of respect. "Mary Ann," Victor said, taking my hand, "it's a beautiful thing you've done here. Arthur would be proud."
"Thank you, Victor," I said. "Please, make yourself at home. The library is completely cleared for your chess games." I turned back to my husband and my sister-in-law. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out 2 heavy yellow industrial janitorial vests and 2 commercial mops. I laid them on the marble floor at William's feet. "Your employment contracts with the Alden Foundation are on the kitchen counter," I said softly, my voice carrying the cold, absolute finality of a master addressing her staff. "You will receive a modest entry-level wage. William, you are in charge of the groundskeeping and the terrace maintenance. Caroline, you will handle the hallway sweeping and the bathroom sanitation. If your work does not meet the foundation's standards, I will have the board terminate your contracts and you can find your own lodging on Elm Street." William stared at the yellow vest on the marble floor. He looked at Victor Bancroft, who was quietly watching him from the library door. For 10 years, William had looked down on the men who worked his machinery. Now, he was going to spend the rest of his life sweeping the floors beneath their feet. With a slow, trembling hand, William reached down and picked up the yellow vest. He slid his arms into the plastic mesh, his head bowing in a posture of complete, absolute submission. Caroline followed his lead, her face wet with tears of pure, shattered pride as she took the mop. I turned to Genevieve, who was standing frozen near the silver champagne bucket. "Genevieve," I said, pointing to the green-glazed ceramic olive dish sitting in the center of the kitchen island. "On Tuesday morning, you told me to hide this dish in the pantry. You said it was too rustic for a Ridley table and that it belonged in a farmhouse." Genevieve looked at the dish, her hand pressing against her silk collar, her face going entirely white. "Mary Ann, I was just trying to maintain the aesthetic." "No, Genevieve," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, cold register that made her flinch. "You were trying to erase my father's name. But Arthur Alden knew you very well. He knew that the moment he passed, you and William would search every corporate safe and trust file to liquidate his work." I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the old ceramic base of the dish. With a soft metallic click, I turned the hidden lock built into the double-walled ceramic base, a custom design my father had crafted in his small workshop 30 years ago. The false bottom of the dish popped open. I reached inside the hollow space beneath the ceramic glaze and pulled out a single, tightly rolled cylinder of thick, heavy parchment paper, sealed with a band of blue wax. It was the original, unregistered bearer shares of Alden Maritime, the offshore holding company that owned the patents beneath every single machine Ridley Enterprises had ever built. It was worth $42 million. They had spent 10 years treating me like a pathetic, impoverished outsider, complaining about my background and trying to force me into a cheap suburban condo, entirely unaware that the worthless, rustic olive dish they wanted me to throw away was the very vault that held their entire $42 million fortune. "The audits will begin now, Genevieve," I said, sliding the blue-sealed parchment into my gray wool coat. "Please take the laundry basket in the hall. The retired factory workers will need fresh sheets by 5 o'clock." Genevieve didn't argue. She slowly took the heavy plastic handles of the laundry basket, her head bowing as she walked toward the basement stairs. I walked out onto the sun-drenched terrace, my old grandfather clock thrumming its heavy, slow count in the hallway behind me. They had spent 10 years trying to make me invisible. But in the quiet, warm light of the terrace, I finally called the meeting to order.